I want to talk about digitization and their impact on the media industries. I guess I want to set out, so this is sort of a funny talk, because I'm talking about a whole bunch of papers, and I'm going to say too many things and too few in the space of about 45 or 50 minutes. So later on we can talk about the things I didn't talk about. But I want to talk about digitization. And at the outset I want to say that digitization has had two different impacts on media industries. Now, on the one hand, there's the bad news on the demand side. Napster arrives in 1999, and ever since Napster, revenue has been just plummeting in recorded music especially, but although it's not Napster, it's other different technological changes that have caused revenue to plummet in the newspaper industry. In other industries, there hasn't been such a piracy shock, but there still is fear and loathing and concern. So there's just bad news on the demand side from new technology in the form of either actually reduced revenue or the threat of reduced revenue. But on the other hand, some of the same technological changes have reduced costs. So there's good news on the supply side, cost reduction on the supply side. There are really enormously, and I'll talk a bit about this, or a fair bit, enormously reduced costs of production, distribution, and even promotion. So those are sort of the good news and the bad news. And then there's something else. Something that's special, specific to media or cultural industries, but there's this nobody knows feature. That is, at the time the investments occur, at the time products are created or imagined to be created, nobody knows which ones will turn out to be successful. And that is going to turn out to be a very important feature that interacts with cost reduction to give rise to the potential for huge impact of technological change on these industries. And in fact, the title that I've chosen here, Digital Renaissance, is a big hint that it's going to be mostly good news. It's not the digital dark ages. All right, so the result is revolutionary effects on recorded music, and that's kind of the canary in the coal mine. That's the industry that experienced most of this stuff first. But as time has unfolded and as my own interests have unfolded, I've decided we should really look not just at music, but also at books, at movies. I've started to look at television. We can talk about photography. A lot of these industries share common features. The technological changes have really revolutionized things. And I guess the punchline is going to be there are lots of new products, many of which are consequential, meaning that is that people buy them and therefore derive value from them. And let's just get it out of the way now that if people buy them, they are therefore by definition high quality. All right, so if this is an aesthetic audience, understand that I'll use the word quality to mean whatever causes people to buy things. And that's because I'm an economist, not because I'm an American. All right, but I have some other goals. On the one hand, I want to say, so in media circles, piracy is kind of, especially in big media, corporate circles, piracy is the big question. And I'd say, yes, piracy is interesting and it's important, but we really ought to focus research energy on the question of whether the supply of new products is robust. The question is not just how well are big media firms or just any media firms doing. If we think about copyright, what's copyright for? Copyright is, these grants of monopoly to provide adequate incentives to bring forth new products. Okay, so in that story, it would be nice to worry about how well off producers are, but really we only care about how well off they are in as much as that gives rise to their bringing forth new products. And so if we think about whether we're experiencing a crisis, we really want to look at the production and usefulness of new products. Tall order, but that's what I hope to be about. And so I'll talk about evidence on music, books, movies, television. And as a side note, and we've had many sidebar conversations about this in this sector, everybody talks about this all the time, but copyright research needs more and better data. I won't talk a lot about how I got my data today, but I just sort of, if you imagine, duct tape, taping things together and literally scraping here and there, we could do even a lot more if we had better data, and it would be good to do that. All right, so here's what I'll literally do. I want to talk about music first. First, I'll talk about the quality of music since Napster, and I'm going to claim that music has been getting better in my economist sense, and then talk a bit about why. And then I want to go and revisit the same set of questions more quickly for motion pictures, for books, and for a little bit for television, and then we'll be done. So it's kind of like, this is a little bit here's what I did with my summer vacation version of the talk, because I'm telling you the order in which I kind of learn these things, but you'll see the common structure of the inquiry. But again, most of the time on music, but then sort of the last half on the other industries. So when we talk about digitization in music, the first thing we always talk about is Napster and the picture of revenue since 1999. I have an updated version of the picture, but the internet didn't work in the room. In any event, revenue has continued to fall since 1999. Physical revenue is off about 80% since 99 in the US, and it's very similar in other countries. even with digital stuff added back in, it's way, way off from what it was. And I think the response to that is that the sky is falling, and I think there's some reason to think that the sky is falling. Certainly, if you take the view that it costs money to bring products to market, if all you knew is that revenue were falling, you'd say, wow, this is a crisis, not just for sellers, but for consumers too, because they'll stop making products. We'll live in an audio stone age. So I don't mean to lampoon this. This is a serious looking problem. And this is the shot across the bow. The research response, and I'll make a little fun of this because I participated in it, but the research response to this event was, I would call a kerfuffle, a little struggle, about whether file sharing cannibalizes sales. Okay, think about the question. The question is, when people can get stuff without paying for it, do they stop paying for it? So it seems like an easy question. It seems like an obvious question. It turns out, if you play by Marquis of Queensberry rules, that is academic rules, it's kind of a hard question to answer. Because after all, things that are being stolen a lot are popular, and they're the same things that are being purchased a lot, so it's easy to come to the conclusion that stealing stimulates sales. I think that's wrong. I think careful studies and the totality of the work that's been done leads to the conclusion that the ability of consumers to obtain without paying reduces the revenue available to the sellers of the products, and that's what's responsible for these sort of catastrophic reduction in revenues. But a couple of years ago, I had this epiphany. There's that road to Damascus where people have epiphanies. But I had the epiphany that, this is obvious to some people. It took me a while, so it's an epiphany for me, but maybe not for a more sensible person. Revenue reduction, really interesting for producers, is not the important question, or not the most important question. Instead, it's, will the flow of products continue? And as an aside, and it shouldn't have to be an aside, but the aside is we have to worry about consumers as well as producers. After all, that's what policymakers are supposed to do. And even, the hard-nosed industrialists, the Recording Industry Association of America and the international analog, the IFPI, they say reduced investment will lead to, well, they don't use these words, but they say reduced investment will lead to an audio stone age. But, file sharing isn't the only innovation. I think I sort of said some of this before, but if you think we're living through a big experiment, it's at least a compound experiment, where on the one hand, you have file sharing, but on the other hand, you have reductions in the cost of production, promotion, and distribution. If that were true, then from the standpoint of providing incentives to create as much stuff as we did before, then maybe weaker IP protection would be enough. Maybe we don't need to strengthen, maybe weaker would be better. And the only way to answer that is to try to empirically address the question, well, what's happened to the quality of new products since Napster, with the goal of contributing to an evidence-based discussion on the adequacy of IP protection. I think that's not a new idea here, evidence-based policymaking, although it is kind of a new idea, right? I mean, when I always hear in the US people talk about evidence-based medicine, and this is a new thing, and you sort of wonder, what did they do before? But the same is true of copyright. We talk now about evidence-based copyright policy. Well, we've been making copyright policy for hundreds of years, and anyways, it's time for some evidence. All right, but onto this specific question of assessing the quality of music over time. Let me concede it. Even for a vulgar economist, this is going to be a hard problem. So let me invoke two approaches that one could use to do this. One is to use what critics say, and in particular, what critics say in their retrospective evaluations of music over multiple years. So obviously, if you were to look at the 10 best of the year and say, how many are there? There are 10 every year. That wouldn't be a helpful approach. But oftentimes, critics will make the 500 best albums of all time, or the 100 best albums or whatever songs of a decade. And if you could assemble a whole bunch of lists of that sort, then you could splice them together and come up with an index of sort of the number of high-quality things coming out each year, and see what's happening to the evolution of the quality of the best stuff over time. So that's one approach, and I'll talk a bit about that now for a few minutes. So Rolling Stone has maybe the most famous of these lists. They released a book in 2004 saying, here are the 500 best albums of all time. And if you take those albums and stick them back into the year in which they were released, you get this time pattern. It looks like this. It rises from 1960 to 1970, and then it falls, then it kind of bumps around and then dwindles to nothing. So that's a famous list. It tells you that the Rolling Stone editors and their stoned friends think that 1970 was the best year in the history of music. Now, didn't want to just rely on Rolling Stone. I wanted to find as many such professional lists as I could. And this is literally what I did with my summer vacation picture for 5 summers ago. I just found a lot of different lists from outfits like Pitchfork and various other kind of information intermediaries in the music business that had multi-year lists of best music. And so what you can see from this is I have a bunch of lists that cover the period back to 1960, and then really a whole bunch of lists that cover the period since 2000, which, by the way, is the year after Napster, so you really care about it in some sense. Want to know what's happening to this index after Napster. So splice them together to create an overall index. If you care about the geeky stuff, it's a regression of the log of, you don't care about the geeky. All right, so what do you get? You get something that looks a lot like the Rolling Stone list. I've covered up the period since Napster just to keep this exciting. It's a little warm in here, we have to stay awake. So what happens after Napster? It flatlines. Remember, revenue is just tanking in this period. So you might have thought that the quality of good stuff would go down. I mean, maybe you wouldn't think that, but you could have thought that. You certainly would think that if you believe the alarmist rhetoric of the industry. But instead, it just continues. And if you want to make a two-handed economist story, you'd say, well, it was falling and now it's not falling, so actually relative to falling, it's rising. I won't go that far, but it's not falling. Okay, so post-Napster constancy is, and if anything, a relative increase. Now, that's approach number one. It's based on critics. There's a lot not to like about relying on critics. They're elites. This is about just a handful of sort of so-called good music. What we'd rather rely on, the economist we, is the decisions of consumers. We'd rather rely on people's choices to infer what's good and what's bad. If good and bad is about what causes people to buy stuff. So the approach I'm going to use here is the following. So suppose you had data on the let's say sales of music or airplay of music, but some measure of consumption by both time and vintage of original release. So for example, in 2010, you see what share of music purchased that year is originally released that year, what share was released last year, 2 years ago, and so forth. Imagine having data like that for multiple calendar years of data, and then many previous years, so back to the beginning of time or 1960. There's another American approach. Anyways, the idea though, so at any point in time, you'll see that older music is used less than newer music. The slight exception being last year is kind of bigger than this year because this year hasn't happened yet, on average. But in general, you just see this depreciation. And the data tell you how much depreciation there is over time. But if you have multiple calendar years of data, then what you can do is you can say, well, go back to each vintage. Is it selling better than vintages typically do when they're that age? And if so, that's a good vintage. Right? So the data can tell you, based on people's choices, which vintages are good and bad. It's really just which vintages get used a lot conditional on their age. If a vintage gets used a lot conditional on how old it is, it's a good vintage. And again, you get to see each vintage in multiple years when it's different ages, so you get to sort of see this multiple times. Now, I have airplay data. So here again, I wish I had, at the time I did this, I wished I had the Nielsen sales data at the song level by calendar year, because then I could also figure out the vintage of each song and the sales, and so forth. I contacted Nielsen. Is this being recorded? Okay, we'll tell the story later over beer. Let's just say I couldn't afford the price that they wanted to charge. It was a big number. And so what I did find instead, I found some airplay data from an economist in the US government who'd done some work, and she had 5 years of airplay data aggregated, right? So it's based on millions of spins on the radio, so you could aggregate back and figure out with high precision what share of the spins in 08 were from 07, 06, 1961, and so forth. So that's one source of data. I have 5 years of airplay data, just the aggregate data, but I get it by by year and vintage. Another source of data I have is the sales, not the Nielsen data, but the sales from the recording industry certifications. When an album hits 500,000, it's called gold, right? When it hits 1 million, it's platinum. When it hits 2 million, it's double platinum. In any event, it's a small share of released albums that hit those sales targets, but it's a large share of sales. So I have those certification data for 40 years or something, since the beginning of their recorded history, and I can use those to calculate these shares of sales by year and vintage. So I have these two sources of data that are kind of like what I wish I had, or they're a lot like what I wish I had, but they're a lot cheaper. Okay, so here's the geeky regression slide. If you want to sort of geeky talk for a second, if you take this share, the share of music sold in year T that's from vintage V, and you take the log of that and regress it on a bunch of age dummies. That just accounts for the depreciation pattern flexibly. After accounting for that, you can still identify vintage effects. Okay? And that's what I'm going to call my vintage quality. And so when you do that, What do you find? Now, so this is entirely independent of that critic stuff we looked at before. But lo and behold, it's kind of similar. It rises from 60 to 70, then it falls. And then we come to the vertical line in Napster. And by the way, I keep talking about Napster, but I don't mean to suggest that Napster, that is the ability of people to steal, in and of itself is going to cause good news. So I just mean 1999 when I say Napster. But what happens? It rises. Okay? The index rises. You could say it's falling after about 2006, but it's still above its average level since about 1975. Right? So something interesting and different is happening here. That's the airplay data. Here's the sales data. So this is, again, the Recording Industry Association certifications. Guess what it looks like? Oh, it rises too. Now what's interesting is these three indices are entirely independent. They're not the same data, and yet they show, I would say, remarkably similar things. An increase 60 to 70, a decline thereafter, and then we hit 1999, and we have an increase in the two usage-based measures. We have a flat line in the critic-based measure. So, what would one say about quality? Well, there's no evidence that the vintage quality has declined. And I should also say, when I say vintage quality, this means the quality of the whole vintage. It might be that there's a lot of crappy things that together are valuable. But it's the vintage, not the particular works that we're measuring here. We're kind of aggregating stuff from a vintage. Anyways, though, no evidence it's declined. More compelling evidence that it's increased. More compelling in the sense that it's based on consumers or program directors' decisions. It is hard to know what might otherwise have been. So, if I said to you, well, therefore, whatever happened around Napster has caused quality to get better, you could rightly say to me, but wait a minute, Napster had some bad news and some good news. What if we just had the good news and not the bad news? Maybe it would be better still. And I would agree with that. I would agree with that completely. I cannot distinguish the bad news aspect of the technological change from the good news aspect. But what is surely true is that the level of this quality thing is above where it was. And it's a big contrast to the alarmist claim that, hey, we're about to enter an audio stone age. Okay? But there's a puzzle. Why continued quality despite the collapse of revenue? And I sort of take these pictures to mean it's kind of a big increase in quality. Why a big increase in quality? Here's where we get to that nobody knows idea. So this is like part 1B, if you like, of the talk. I'm still talking about music, but I'm going to talk about why would it be that music would get better in the face of these two conditions. Okay? So this fundamental feature of creative products is this nobody knows anything idea, which is, it's all over Caves' book, but it's also from William Goldman, the screenwriter, who wrote this Adventures in the Screen Trade book that says nobody knows anything about which movies are going to succeed. It seems to be true of many other cultural products. Hard to predict at the time of investment. Some, we hear different numbers. I think Ruth, you had a number 1 in 40, but you hear 1 in 10. You hear numbers like that. And traditionally, thinking back to music, it has been expensive to experiment in Turvio's sense of the term, which means we don't know which thing is going to win with consumers until we release it. So we've got to go ahead and make the video, record the album, do the promotion, whatever. And you got to do that stuff to bring it to market to find out which things are winners. And the IFPI, still, if you look at their Investing in Music report, even this year's report, it says it costs us $1 million to bring a record by a new artist to market. I don't know if they're saying this kind of ironically, but I mean, I think it's true. Right? Their model is we rent studio time, we bribe radio station, or whatever we pay for promotion, and it costs us, we also give in advance, it costs us $1 million to take a draw. Okay? And so the traditional model has been, well, let's choose a small number of artists, let's bet on them, but because it's an inherently hard problem, few of them succeed. Okay? Now, digitization comes along. We already talked about piracy, and we talked about cost reduction. So let me talk a little bit more about these, and we'll say a little more as we go. I mean, in the music context, the cost of recording has plummeted. Now, artists will argue with me because they'll say there's a difference between like real recording studios and professional producers and so forth versus GarageBand and your iPhone. But nevertheless, many products are brought to market at very low cost. Distribution, nobody would argue, distribution has become trivially inexpensive. Because you can upload an MP3 file for US-wide distribution for like $10. So that's what it costs to have. And I think global distribution is not much more expensive. So those are kind of trivially inexpensive. Promotion remains a bottleneck, and this is what the earlier talk today was very interestingly about. Promotions is still a challenge. But I'm going to present evidence that promotion has changed a lot. It's become less of a bottleneck, and the information environment has changed, making it easier for products to become known to consumers. And if all this stuff's true, then you'd say it's become cheaper to experiment. We can take more draws from the urn, and maybe we discover more stuff. So here's where we get to how could it be that quality would really improve? And actually, let me, I think in words I could do it better than this slide. In a world in which there was no unpredictability, suppose costs fell relative to what happened to revenue such that you're going to get more products. But if it were perfectly predictable, you'd just get new products that are kind of worse than the worst old product. All the good stuff would already have been released, so you just get kind of crappy stuff. But in a world that's really unpredictable, if costs fall, now you're taking more draws out of this random process. Some of them are terrible, but some of them are going to be really good. So what am I in kind of real terms, what we mean, think about artists who look you don't look that marketable to me. I would just say no to you in the old world. But now somebody's going to say yes. An indie label is going to say, you know what, I'll take a chance on you. And much of it turns out to be garbage. Economic garbage, but aesthetic fine. But some of it turns out to be very economically successful. Right? So if that's true, then something we ought to see is that there are a lot of these ex-ante losers, that is low expected value products, turning out to be ex-post winners. So that's one of the things we want to look at as we go through here. All right, so that's what that slide's really about, but I think better in English than in this sort of nonsense language. All right, fine, we already said all this. So if this story's right, and by the way, I welcome clarifying questions at any time. I'd rather interrupt the flow and prevent confusion, but deep questions I want to defer till never, or later certainly. All right, so this explanation for how could music have gotten a lot better, I think of it as having kind of 4 component questions. So number 1, are there more new products? Including so-called indies, this sort of low ex-ante quality or low ex-ante appeal products. Number 2, do consumers have ways to learn about a proliferation of new products? So hint, hint, there will be a proliferation of new products, so let's not have any suspense about that. So we'll look at things like changing roles of traditional modes of promotion, internet and critics and so forth. A third question that we can sometimes address is sales concentration rising or falling? That is, we have a whole bunch of new products, let's say. If they were all just garbage, they wouldn't attract any market share away from the old kinds of products. And so we'd see no change in sales concentration. On the other hand, if there are lots of new products and it turns out some of them are appealing, you should see a deconcentration of sales. A fourth question rather, and it's in red because it's kind of the big test. Do the products with less ex-ante promise, like the indie artists in music who would not have been released or not have meaningfully been released before digitization, do they account for a rising share of the ex-post success, the commercially successful artists? So I don't know if we have time for an anecdote. So this is sort of the story, a story to pin on if you don't even like data. Just think about Arcade Fire, which is a pretty hip band. Their third album, The Suburbs, came out in 2011. It was critically acclaimed. It has a high Metascore. Metacritic is this website that aggregates critics, and 87 is a pretty good score. It's like an A, about 5%. It had very little conventional airplay in the US. It didn't appear ever in the Billboard Hot 100, but it had a fair bit of play on internet radio. Last FM, lots of spins on Last FM. In fact, here's a graph of the spins on Last FM. It was also quite successful. It sold more than 500,000 copies. It was certified gold, and it also won the Best Album Grammy in 2011. Not the best hipster album or whatever, no, the best album, period. So this is a story of a product that really is circumventing the traditional powerhouse intermediaries. But what about the plural of anecdote, which is data? Okay, so has there been growth in releases? I know from Billboard magazine that the number of products in the Nielsen data for the US has tripled between 2000 and 2010. That's the number of new products, not the number of the stock of total products, but rather the flow of products has tripled from 2000 to 2010. If you try to sort of verify that number with various different data sets, you'll see other, like Music Brains, you'll see a pretty big growth. So something like this is true. It's surely true there's been a growth in the number of releases. But the exact tripling is a little hard to say. Second, so this is sort of a list of the 4 questions we'll address. The second question is about the changing information environment. And so what can we say about that? Traditional radio in the US So I wish I had the full airplay data for every station and so forth. Can't afford that. But what I could get is the Billboard, they call it the Hot 100, but for some odd reason it has 75 songs on it each week. So I got the Billboard Hot 100 over some number of years. So that's 3,900 listings per year, 52 weeks times 75. There are only about 300 distinct artists per year. Right? That tells you that heavy airplay stuff is very concentrated. And we know this from other sources. Future of Music Coalition did a pretty neat study where they got some more airplay data, and they said, no, it's very concentrated, indies aren't on there, and so forth. But if you compare this traditional terrestrial radio with internet radio, now here I wish I had what Pandora plays, I wish I had what Spotify plays. I did, at the time I did this, have what Last FM played. Last FM, I finally figured, so Last FM, they report, and you even archive, the top 420 songs of the week. And for a couple of years, I was going around saying, 420, why 420? That's such a strange number. And young people would snicker at me. Anybody snickering? So 420 is something about pot. It's a marijuana number. I don't know what that is. Okay, April 20th is like some day. I said, well, my children even know this now. Anyways, if you compare the Last FM stuff with the terrestrial radio stuff, and so what this table does, it just compares the top Billboard artists that are not at Last FM, and here's the top Last FM artists that are not at Billboard. They're very different. Okay? The overlap is overall is only about 10%, but this is sort of very mainstream stuff. This is, when my kids were younger, we used to listen to satellite radio. There was a station called 20 on 20, which is the top 20 songs every 3 hours. I thought, to me, it was like the soundtrack of hell. But this is like hipster stuff to a greater extent. I realize the Beatles are on there, that's not quite hipster, but it's a very different list than that. My main point from putting up this table, apart from entertainment, is just that internet radio allows promotion for a different set of artists than are being promoted on terrestrial traditional radio. And so I'm trying to make the point the information environment has changed in a way that consumers can learn about more music and that artists have access to more consumers, or a wider range of artists. Another bite at the same apple is to think about online criticism. So this is a funny chart, but what it shows, if you look at all the reviews at Metacritic and trace them back to the publication they're from, and then ask when did the underlying publication come into existence, you'll see that there's like 15,000 reviews from Rolling Stone, which came into existence way back when. But then as you kind of come forward to the more recent period, you see the slope increases. You see in the kind of late 90s, you get stuff like Pitchfork, which is a pure online and a very important source of information. You see this big growth in information sources. So that, again, I'm trying to make the point that the information environment has become much richer. Another way to see the same thing is to think about Metacritic. Metacritic's reviewing like on the order of 1,000 albums per year by the late 2000s. They come into existence in the year 2000. And remember, the number of songs with heavy airplay on terrestrial radio, or number of artists rather, was 300. Metacritic's reviewing 1,000, and very little repeat artists. So there's a lot more information available about a lot more products. So there's kind of a possibility assertion that people could learn about more stuff. All right, just maybe a last point about this. Again, this enrichment of the information environment. If you think about success in promotional channels, you can ask, what's happening to the role of traditional airplay versus the role of critics? So here what I'm doing is I'm looking at the Billboard 200. So the Billboard 200 is the top 200 albums of the week. I've got that weekly for many years. And I can ask for each of those, when I aggregate it up to the year, I can ask for each of those artists what share are also heavily played on the radio. And with the Billboard Hot 100 data. And you can see, going back to 1990, it's kind of flat, a little bit declining, and then it becomes a much more steeply declining share. So airplay is becoming less important among those who ultimately succeed, whereas the share who are being reviewed in Metacritic is rising. Okay, so I don't want to push the causal claim here too hard, but there's certainly a change in the ways, or of the things that become successful. There's a change in the promotional avenues or the promotional channels. All right. How about on to sales concentration? So the question here again was, well, hey, if there are a whole bunch of new products and they're good, they have to attract some sales share away from, the old kinds of products. I don't actually have sales data. So I don't actually have sales data. I have the Billboard 200, which is a ranking of the top 200 by week. But what I can do with the Billboard 200 is I can ask, well, how many distinct products appear on the Billboard 200 during the year? Okay, so it kind of sounds like a dumb question, but it's not. So in a week, you have 200. If the same 200 were on all year, there would be 200 in the year. On the other hand, if each product lasted 1 week, you'd have 10,400 products. So the number, whatever the number turns out to be, tells me something about sales concentration. Here's what it looks like. From 1985 to 2000, it's essentially flat between 550 and 600. After 2000, the number of distinct products on the list rises pretty quickly and substantially. It's consistent with a deconcentration. Okay? It's consistent with a deconcentration. It's consistent with the new products entering and attracting attention away from old products. It's consistent with other things too, I think. Then finally, this ex-ante promise and ex-post success. And again, I think this is maybe the most important test. Do the artists with less ex-ante promise, who would not have made it to market in a big way prior to digitization, now achieve sales success? So what this is the indie record share of the Billboard 200. So I'm relying here on the Billboard definition of an indie. They have an indie chart, so I merged the two. And anyways, what you see is that the overall share goes from about 12 in 2001 to about 35% in 2010. That's an increase. If you even just look at the very top of the Billboard chart, the top 25 by week, it goes from 6 to about 18. So it's a tripling. It's a real increase in the number of these, what I would call ex-ante losers, with affection, not with scorn, that turn out to be ex-post winners. Yes, and if you're of a certain age, then you know this line from the Tom Petty song, even the losers get lucky sometimes. All right, so summing up music. Digital disintermediation, which is some word you might use for all this stuff, provides a possible explanation for increased quality. Given the unpredictability, more experimentation, just means more products coming to market, draws from urns if you like, leads to the discovery of more so-called good music. A lot of distancing quotes here, because I know that music people get upset about the quality word. A lot of ex-ante losers become ex-post winners. And a lot of this stuff wouldn't have happened without the cost reductions associated with digitization. All right, so what about other cultural products? How am I doing on time?
You're right. You've got about 10 more?
Okay, good, because these I'm going to do a little more quickly, a lot more quickly, frankly. So let's think about books and motion pictures and just a tiny bit about television, and we can think later about other products where we might want to think this. But for each one, we'd like to ask the following questions, at least when we can. Are there more products? Are there ways to learn about the new products? Is there changing sales concentration? Is there growing success of ex-ante losers, independent products of some sort? And finally, are the new vintages good, which is our jumping off point in music? I found it was good and tried to understand how it could be. If we can also ask that question of these media or these products, that would be useful. So books. First of all, there's been a lot of growth in new products. Maybe the most stunning thing is the growth of self-published ebooks, but just self-published books generally. It's hard to find really good numbers, but there are a variety of data sources that certainly all point to growth. So if you look at self-published ebooks in the US, the number released per year is about 50,000 in 2006. It's up around 400,000 in the year 2012. Okay, there's also a growth in the supporting ecosystem, just the share of adults with tablets and e-readers. So there's a big growth in this world in which it's possible to release a product. You just write something, type it up with PDF, you upload it to Amazon, and now you are an author with distribution. By the way, the structure of the contract at Amazon is if you price it at $5 or more, then they take 30%, you take 70%, and it's an interesting arrangement if you sell anything. Okay, so yes, there's growth, especially in self-published ebooks, and it's been supported by this diffusion of tablets and e-readers. What about sales concentration? So here again, I got to say, I don't really have the data I wish I had. What I do have is the USA Today bestseller list, which is, I don't know if you know the movie Men in Black. One of the great little jokes in the movie Men in Black is that the only reliable news sources are the supermarket tabloids, because they report on UFOs. Anyways, well, here, USA Today, which is kind of a joke in the US, you get it free at your hotel, but nobody ever buys it. In any event, it has the best and most credible bestseller list. Why? Because even as early as 2008 or so, they were including ebooks, including self-published books, whereas the New York Times, little footnote said, well, we don't systematically include self-published books, and we don't include books that are priced under a certain price. It's like, wow, are you captured by the industry? In any event, the USA Today list is kind of good. 150 titles per week. I have it back to 1993. And so this is, again, the game of saying how many titles appear during the year. And it's pretty flat from 1993 up till about 2007 or something. This is right around the time ebooks explode in the US, and you see a big growth in the number of titles on the list during the year. Again, consistent with the idea that growth of the availability of titles is attracting consumption away from traditional sorts of products. Now, what about the commercial success of the ex-ante losers? So here, what we've done is to use, this is by the way with joint with Imke Reimers, a former Minnesota student who's now a professor at Northeastern. Anyways, for every book in the USA Today list, we figured out, was it originally a self-published book? Okay, was it originally a self-published book? And so we're looking at the share of titles that began their life on the list as a self-published book. And what you see is that the share of the bestseller listings, originally self-published, is 0, and then it sort of jumps up, and by mid-2013, it's around 15%. It has declined a bit since then. I'm not sure if this is a signal or noise, but this is really a consequential share. Think about it. These are books that were published. It's true. In some cases, it's an already famous person who says, you know what, I'll just trade on a reputation. There's not that much of that, though. It's mostly unknown folks who haven't had a previous traditionally published book, and they're achieving, this high share of the bestseller list at USA Today. In the romance category, it's about 40%. Of course, there's the well-known best book ever written, by my quality definition, 50 Shades of Grey. But again, this is by titles, not by sales. So it is true that the 50 Shades of Grey trilogy accounts for 4 titles, because there's each of the elements of the trilogy and the box set, but it's still not explaining most of this, because 40% of 150 is a number like 60. Oh, sorry, but it's not 150 romances, so you got to divide that by something. All right, so that's books. How about movies? Now, I originally kind of had trepidation about movies. In the US, movies is a serious business. It's like our only successful export industry, so you don't want to monkey with it. And movies are really expensive. The Hollywood movies, Motion Picture Association of America movies, cost on average $100 million to make. They stopped reporting this number a few years ago, but you can still kind of figure it out. It's still on average about $100 million to make movies. And if you listen to their lobbying statements, they really talk a lot about jobs, jobs, jobs. That's the appeal they make in Washington. So let's see what's going on with movies. By the way, jobs, jobs, jobs is not about consumers, it's about producers. But I assume what it means is a reduction in the number of products would also reduce the number of key grips that need to be employed. Let's think a little bit about technological change and its effect on costs in motion pictures. Unlike music, movies and books haven't had a Napster-like negative shock to revenue. It is true there's lots of piracy of movies, especially in countries like China. But it's not true that there used to not be piracy than there was. We haven't had like an experiment in which there was a big negative shock to revenue. But we have had a shift on the cost side. It was pretty clear what it was in books. You upload your PDF and now it's a product. In movies, it's a little different, but it's actually kind of similar. On the production side, I realize that the camera cost is not a big component of $100 million. But what is true is that for a couple $1,000s, you can have a camera that's good enough to make a movie that you release in the US, right? It's cost $2,000 now, whereas it cost basically $250,000. Plus you had to pay for film developing and so forth, not long ago. So there's been this rapid change in production costs. Distribution has changed. Now it is true that there's still theatrical distribution that's expensive, but there are these other ways to distribute movies. And I'll show you data on this as we go, but there are these new strategies like release it in one theater, get a review, and then release it at the iTunes movie store, or sell it through Amazon, or get Netflix to pick it up. There are all these different ways to release products, and a lot of products are getting released that way. Then there's promotion, and I'll show you some data on there. Are a lot of movies reviewed online, and there's just kind of an enrichment of the information environment, all of which raises the possibility of more new movies that might actually be discovered by and be of interest to consumers. Is this true? Well, yeah. So digital cameras, I talked a little bit about this, but it's just been this rapid fall in costs, and it creates an opportunity for independent filmmakers. I didn't have the anecdote in the slides, but Ed Burns, the guy who was in Saving Private Ryan, he's also a filmmaker. He's made a few movies. He releases them for a week, then he sells them through iTunes, and they end up on HBO. If he and his 3 friends who are in the movie, if they make $10 million in revenue, they keep something like $7 million. That's not a bad payday, right? That's not a bad payday. And that's a real movie with real actors in it and so forth. Maybe it's even good. Okay, this is just a picture, a bar chart that shows the share of movies that are made with digital cameras. IMDb, it's a wonderful data source, which by the way is owned by Amazon now. Among other things, for some movies, shows you what kind of camera was used to make it. And this thing that appears to be growing is the digital stuff. So I'm just trying to say, it's not just me saying you could buy one cheaply. In fact, they're being used. And this is skewed toward the bigger budget movies. So yes, this digitization on the production side is a real thing. Oh, I have this Attack of the Digital Clones thing here because Attack of the Clones was one of the first movies to use digital cameras for a lot of its filming. Or not filming, but a lot of its shooting. Now, I think this slide was supposed to come later, but in any event, if you think about releases, the number of products, the major releases, the Motion Picture Association of America releases, actually have not increased at all. If you were to look at this, you'd say, well, it's kind of flat. Maybe it's actually declining. 2012, I think, was a low year, 144 releases, which is a small number. It almost looks like, wow, releases are falling. Whoa, I touched this thing. But if you look at overall production, it's way up. Now, how do I even measure production? What I do for this picture is I query the IMDb database, and I ask it for features. So I distinguish here, this is US origin features, US origin documentaries by release year. Okay, so it doesn't include the TV, it doesn't include shorts, it's feature length stuff. And you see that, it was a number like a few hundred, and then it just rises rather rapidly, especially this kind of an inflection point after the digitization stuff, after the cheaper production. Oh, I didn't do that again. So it really looks like there's been an explosion in new products. Now, if we just want to focus for a second, so we're talking about 3,000 features released in the US and another 4,000 documentaries in a recent year. And these are world as opposed to US, and you see it's not just a US phenomenon, it's a worldwide phenomenon. But what does release mean, right? Because not all released movies are even commercially available, not even possible to purchase them. So what I'm trying to do in this slide is just to sort of lay out different kinds of releases. Down here we have the Motion Picture Association big movies released into sort of 500 screens or more. But then up here we have the total number of movies released into theaters. So remember, there are 3,000 features made, 4,000 documentaries. There are about 600 movies released into theaters in the US, of which about 150 are the major things, wide release. So one notion of release is this kind of limited release that gets you to the 600 number. But another notion of release is just available for purchase. So this is the sort of less information than there appears to be on this slide. What I'm trying to say is, if you look at vintage 2010 movies and ask, in the year 2013, how many were available via which channels? What you'd find is that in 2013, there were over 1,000 vintage 2010 movies available on streaming Netflix. Remember that in 2010, there had been 600 or so released into theaters, but there are 1,000 available at Netflix. And remember, streaming Netflix has everything but the good stuff. So this is an underestimate of the total. There are 1,200 available at Amazon Instant. Now, Amazon Instant includes both kind of the low-value Prime service and just the a la carte service. So the 1,200 includes the good stuff. So basically, two times as many movies from 2010 are available for purchase as were released into theaters. Right? So just a lot more movies that are both produced and, in some sense, a little bit successful because they're available. Now, what about product discovery? Right, so that whole thing was just to say, yeah, more products. But can we find out about them? Can we know about them? And so I just want to point out the range of information sources. And so here, I'm relying on IMDb again and asking the question, suppose you think about the top 1,000 movies over time, and ask, has it been reviewed by pros? By not just, just individuals who rate it, but rather some publication. The top 250 from 1990 to 2010, they've always been ubiquitously reviewed. The next 250 have generally been reviewed. Okay, a little bit of growth from 1990 to 2010. But now you get to the next, the 500 to 750 and the 750 to 1,000. Those really weren't reviewed before. But now you can find various sources that review them that are indexed by Amazon. So it's just evidence that there's a lot more movies about which you could learn from some somewhat reputable source. It's not just a liar, it's not just an individual fraudulently submitting reviews to TripAdvisor or something. There's also the direct, kind of user-generated stuff. If you ask how many movies at IMDb by vintage have a user rating, we're looking at a number like 2,400. Remember, in a year in which I claimed there were 3,000 movies made, and from that vintage, 1,000 or so were available from various sources. So there's just lots of information out there. This is a hard slide to explain, but I'm just trying to take the movie Argo. There are 588 reviews of Argo linked at IMDb. There's a wide range of reviewers. And what I did is I took the Alexa rank. Alexa is this cool website that tells you the traffic rank of every website. And if you just take the log of that number, that way you can put numbers like 10 million and numbers like 5 in the same scale. You see that these are rather obscure. These are rather well known. These vertical lines occur at Rolling Stone and IndieWire, two pretty well known sources of reviews. But there are these much more obscure, but still kind of professionalized sources of information. So yeah, there's more information out there. So then the last kind of question about movies is, well, do the independent movies succeed? Now, independent is a challenging word. There are different definitions of it. And so if you look, for example, at the Independent Spirit Awards, which is a pretty prominent film award, you look at the guidelines, it says, well, it can be made by a major studio as long as it articulates an independent vision. Oh goodness, that's not a definition I can work with. And then if you look at IndieWire, which is a pretty prominent source of information, and when I first saw it, I thought, this is great. They have a weekly box office ranking. This is a nice definition of independent movies. Turns out their definition is released on fewer than 500 screens, which means that it was known at the time of release that it wouldn't be successful. So it wouldn't have broad appeal. So that's not a good definition either. What I go with is something I can do. It's whether it was produced by a major studio. Okay, but even this, people who know a lot about movies would like to complain, and I share their concerns. What you'd really like to know is who financed it, and I don't really know. But I do know this. So what I'm going to look at here is the independent movie share of box office revenue and of DVD revenue where I have it. So box office revenue, okay, I'm almost done. Box office revenue is pretty easy to get good data on that. And you see that the blue line is box office revenue. The indie share in 1990 was sort of 25%, fell a bit, and then recently it's risen rather substantially. The indie share of, this is DVD listings, the top 50 per week or something. I didn't expect it to be very indie heavy because the top 50, but it's actually surprisingly indie heavy, and increasingly so. If you look at the share of movies available through various streaming channels and on television, you see that it's very generally rising trend. So it's kind of a measure of success of this indie stuff. Now, are the new movies good? I know I'm almost done, so let me just talk a little bit about good. Two ways to measure good here, one based on critics, one based on usage. Rotten Tomatoes is this very nice website that aggregates reviews of a wide range of movies, and you can ask about that set of movies over the past 20 years, how many are above some absolute standard? 87 is a very good score. And you just see a big increase in the absolute number of movies that are getting kind of A's, high grades. Of those top movies, what share are from independent studios? Well, it was 20% in 1980, now it's about 80%. Boom. Yeah. This, I didn't mean to go to this slide quite this quickly, but in any event, you might say, but wait a minute, Joel, just 20 minutes ago you said we shouldn't really trust elites, we should just trust the common people. If you look at Metacritic, every movie has both an elite critic score and a user score. You can see they're pretty highly correlated. So if you thought about the Rotten Tomatoes information as being, one way would be say it's an aesthetic judgment, which would be interesting to some. You could also say it's correlated with what regular old folks think, and so you'd say it's an economic judgment as well. All right, our new vintage is good. I know we're out of time, so I'll just show you a picture for a second. That stuff we did with vintages before, suppose we had movie data by time and vintage, which I don't. What I have is TV listing data by time and vintage. Here again, I called Tribune Media Services, and they priced me out of the market, so I got something at the Wayback Machine. But it does look like, by my wacky way of measuring quality, that it's been increasing from 80 to about 2005. It's a little curious that it's falling in the period when there's an explosion of new products, so I'm not quite sure what to make of that. All right, though, we won't talk about television except to say similar things are happening there. New digital technology has brought threats to creative industries through piracy, but it's also brought opportunities. There's been a huge growth in new products and distribution, and the new products, the indie, this and that, self-published, whatever word you want for sort of outsider, ex-ante, low appeal products, make up large and growing shares of what turns out to be successful. The threats to revenue are real. I don't mean to poo-poo that, but there's no sign of diminished output, and there's no sign that consumers are deriving less satisfaction from the new stuff. And that's the sense in which the works are better. So, when we think about public policy, rights holders are concerned about declining revenue, and this is clearly understandable. I'm worried about online teaching. But I mean, copyright exists to provide incentives for creative activity, and despite the revenue performance in various industries, there doesn't seem to be any crisis in creation. So that's my stuff.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joe. We have time for one or two quick questions if you have. Right at the back, Jim.
Can you go and tell the DCMS Select Committee, please?
Pardon me?
Can you go and tell the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, please?
Give me an invitation, I'll go.
I think this is really not heard enough by policymakers. How do you get it through?
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the reasons I was excited to come talk here is because there's some people interested in copyright stuff, and so I like to talk about it with people who are interested. But you're right, really, it's like, you need to make peace with your enemies, not your friends. They're not my enemies. By the way, they used to like me when I discovered that piracy reduced revenue. They liked me. I have a screenshot when they liked me of the RIA website. I don't think they like me.
Yeah.
So we found out that digitalization helps unknown producers grow into the market. Do these producers stay in the market after their first success?
I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, because it could be that you have a whole bunch of sort of one-shot, and there are a few different aspects to that. One is, one of the, and I don't mean to poo-poo the concern. One of the traditional concerns of the industry is that they invest in artists, right? They it's not just curation, but also actual investment. And it could be that we're missing out on that now, and so people don't last as long because they haven't sort of been invested. I mean, that said, let's suppose that you release an album and it's unsuccessful and your label lets you go. In the new world, that just means you go self-release or you go with a smaller indie this time. So that doesn't still speak to your question, which is about whether people continue to like the same product. But if your investor, your patron, stops investing in you, it doesn't mean you're done. You can go with another patron for your next album.
Yeah, we've got time for you.
Well, just briefly, an extension of the same question, but might there not be a study to find out whether this leads to diversification, as in your ex-ante producers, critically appreciated works become 8% more in 2012. Are they bought out or not?
Oh, right. So the traditional way, it's interesting. Like, what's the role for traditional style producers versus new style producers? And traditionally, I think the new genres of music have been, in some sense, discovered outside of the traditional. Like, Mitch Miller hated rock and roll, so they weren't going to release rock and roll. And rap was an unknown thing to the white guys, and so they didn't, but then these labels produce stuff, and then the majors buy them. That's the way they kind of buy and get into innovation, is they buy stuff. The world's changed, though, so now, anecdotes are dangerous, but Justin Bieber, who keeps coming up, his stuff was on YouTube, and it became pretty clear that it was very successful, very appealing to people, and so he goes straight into a big major. The point being that you don't need to be, sometimes you don't even need to be championed by a knowledgeable intermediary. Sometimes you can just be discovered by the crowd and then go straight to success. But the last little point, which is major relevant to your statement, is also that think about the role for the majors. What seems to be happening, they're not dying as fast as you might have thought. They're specializing in more predictably successful stuff. And predictably successful arises from two sources. One is, well, you already had a successful release from us, or we saw it from another label. But the other is, like the Justin Bieber story, where, well, you have no previous albums, but it's clear that you're going to be successful because you had 1 million downloads, or not downloads, but streams at YouTube. So, and it kind of makes sense because the majors still have better promotional capabilities than indies. So if you are successful, that is, if you are predictably successful, you're not a 1 in 10 draw, you're a 1 in 3 draw or something, it still makes sense for a major to release you. and to use their muscle to try to sell you.
I'm afraid I think we should stop now because there are various things people need to go and do and so forth. I'm going to tell you about that. But before I do that, can we say thank you again to Joel, please?